I'm probably not going to be saying anything new in this video for people who are longtime viewers of this channel, but I do like to come back time and again to different topics that I think are important and to hammer on those topics again. And that's what I want to do here. I want to explain succinctly, I hope, how evangelical apologists and evangelical Christians widely are moral relativists. They are cultural moral relativists. And that's an irony because, in fact, they purport to be moral objectivists often and to critique moral relativists, which means not only are they cultural relativists or moral relativists, but they're also hypocritical about it. So, to begin with, let's define terms. I'm going to define moral objectivism as the view that there are universal objective moral principles pertaining to the good, or what is good or evil, and the right, what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. And they are objective in the sense that they apply to all persons, regardless of the cultural background or personal beliefs of individuals. Some moral truths exist independently of human opinions and can be discovered through moral intuition and rational inquiry, and perhaps through revelation as well. But that's a sidebar. So that's moral objectivism. Second, we have cultural relativism. This view denies that there are objective moral principles which have their facticity, their truthfulness, independent of human beings or human cultures. Rather, moral principles regarding the good and the right are uh, relative. Their facticity or truthfulness is relative to their embedding in a cultural context. And it is the cultural framework which constitutes their facticity as truth or false. They are true relative to a culture, not absolutely true. So that's the contrast between moral objectivism and moral cultural moral relativism. Now, of course, evangelical Christians and evangelical apologists widely claim to be moral objectivists, and in fact, they are famous for criticizing cultural relativism as a culturally or morally corrupt, indefensible view. And yet, I want to argue they are de facto themselves cultural relativists. You can see it in the fact that evangelical Christians and evangelical apologists in particular defend divinely commanded biblical violence. God both commanding, for example, the slaughter of civilians, and God commending the act of slaughtering civilians when people undertake it, when his disciples or the followers of the people of Israel undertake it against their enemies. And it is typically explained, well, this is at least in part the explanation is the ancient Near East was a different cultural context than the modern world. The standards of warfare, the standards of civilians, and the understanding of culpability, all of these things were different in the ancient Near East. So, for example, the ancient Near East, we are told, practiced a form of total warfare in which everybody, all parties in war, would attack indiscriminately civilian populations and not just soldiers. And there was also an understanding of a corporate guilt that was shared among all parties, so that even a small child or an infant would be considered to be culpable or responsible for the sins of the nation. And this is different than our contemporary cultural context, in which we believe that civilians shouldn't be targeted in war, but only that combatants should be targeted, and in which we don't believe that children, for example, hold the moral culpability of their nation such that they could be punished or killed for the sins of the nation, but rather that culpability should be held by the specific individuals who are culpable for their own actions. And what the evangelical apologist here is saying is they are cultural relativists. With respect to the ancient Near East, there was a different standard of warfare and a different standard of shared guilt that obtained. And so, within that context, God rightly commanded the slaughter of civilians, and he commended the slaughter of civilians when it occurred, such as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 20 or 1 Samuel 15. Another example, in the ancient Near East, different understandings of the status, social status of unmarried and orphaned teenage girls, for example. and about what their rights were and the fact that they could be viewed as property. And so within the ancient Near Eastern world, in Numbers 31, we read about the Israelite soldiers slaughtering men, women, and boys, but kidnapping the teenage virgin girls for their own army. You read that in Numbers 31. So this is a form of human kidnapping, child kidnapping, war brides, and arguably sex slavery, looked at through the lens of a modern view. And specifically with respect to sex slavery or rape, what we have here is a contemporary understanding of what is required to have sexual consent. What is required is that a person must be able to give consent, they must freely give consent, and they must give consent enthusiastically throughout a sexual encounter. And arguably, you can't have those three criteria obtained when a 15 or 16-year-old just witnessed her father, mother, and siblings slaughtered, and then is kidnapped by the soldiers who just butchered her family, is given a month to grieve, as we read in Deuteronomy, and then is married off to one of the men who killed her family. How can she freely consent to sexual activity with one of the men who had just slaughtered, butchered her family? Uh, it strains credulity that one could have that. And so, what you end up doing is throwing out the modern conception of consent, saying, well, in the ancient Near Eastern world, just like they had a different understanding of shared culpability and of targeting civilians in warfare, so they had a different understanding of consent. And we should not judge the ancient Near Eastern world in which God established the kingdom of Israel by contemporary 21st century standards. And what I'm telling you is that that just de facto falls into a type of cultural relativism in which we judge the ancient Near Eastern world relative to the cultural standards of that world, and we judge our world relative to our cultural standards, and never the twain shall meet. They're just two independent moral universes. That's cultural relativism. And the funny thing is, the evangelical apologist is fearless when critiquing cultural relativism in their contemporary secular interlocutors. And yet they themselves are defending a de facto cultural relativism with respect to their own views. Now, add on the fact that they have this penetrating moral vision of moral objectivism when it comes to one thing, and that is the status of the fetus, human fetus, in utero. For some reason, they have this moral clarity of vision that it is always, everywhere, and for any reason wrong to kill a fetus in utero, certainly on the grounds of elective abortion, at any point in gestation, from conception through to parturition. In other words, from the moment that embryo first begins to exist to the moment when that full term baby is born. It is wrong to kill that child, that fetus developing in utero. They know that with absolute moral clarity. That is true once, everywhere, and for all. And yet, at the same time, they are defending the slaughter of babies ex utero in the ancient Near East. That is the degree of cognitive dissonance that makes me want to bang my head into a wall. And it is just gross moral hypocrisy on the part of these apologists who defend a de facto cultural relativism about the violence of the Bible in the ancient Near East, and yet want to claim they are moral absolutists about one thing, the fetus in utero. Finally, some evangelical apologists try to find a middle ground by appealing to accommodation. For example, Christopher Wright, a biblical scholar, famously did this. I'm going to say it's famous anyway, famously did it in his book, The God I Don't Understand, where he said, look, okay, yeah, slaughtering of civilians in the ancient Near East is a pretty hard thing to swallow, but maybe this was the best God could do. He was just accommodating to the standards of warfare in the ancient Near East, but he eventually wanted to bring the Israelites out of that to a fuller understanding. Now, for a few different reasons, this is just a mind-numbing middle ground. First of all, we are supposed to assume that the God, the Judeo-Christian God that Christians worship, is omnipotent. Okay, he's all powerful. Hold on a second, my dog's barking. Okay, so now I've got Timbit with me so he can look out the window and hopefully not bark while I conclude this video. Okay, we are supposed to believe that the Judeo-Christian God that Christians worship is omnipotent. That God is all powerful. And yet, the most that that all powerful God can do when he reveals himself in space time in the ancient Near East is to accommodate to civilian mass slaughter and child kidnapping and rape. Like that's the best God can do. He's omnipotent, but he has to accommodate to the slaughter of civilians and the kidnapping of children and then selling them off into sex slavery with the soldiers that killed their families because he's has to accommodate them. This, of course, makes no sense, and it directly contradicts Jesus, who comes in the first century and challenges all these most fundamental assumptions. For example, here's a fundamental assumption. It has been said, hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. That is earth shattering, paradigm busting revelation. Jesus had no problem delivering that. And yet we're supposed to believe that somehow God in the ancient Near East had to say, yeah, let's just slaughter your civilian neighbors because that's the best I can do with your ancient Near Eastern morality. I mean, it's just utterly indefensible, incoherent position. Now, the next thing to note is this. Ultimately, the accommodation itself is morally justifiable or not. Jesus talks about, you can say, a morally justifiable accommodation in Matthew 19. He talks about how because the hearts of the people were hardened, that God accommodated to their desire for divorce and God allowed divorce to happen. And I think conceptually, we can say that's plausible. It's plausible that maybe God did accommodate to some degree to the moral understanding of peoples. So, for example, he allowed divorce when in fact it was his ultimate purpose not to have divorce in the long term. But to try to apply that to slaughtering children and infants, it wasn't God's ultimate purpose or desire that his people would slaughter and butcher children and infants and kidnap girls and sell them to sex slavery. But he accommodated that for a while. I mean, that again is just nonsense. Those are categories of action that are categorically different than divorce. So while God could accommodate divorce, as Jesus refers to in Matthew 19, it's utterly implausible. This contradicts the most fundamental moral sense that God could accommodate to mass civilian slaughter or to the kidnapping of girls and selling them into sex slavery. So ultimately, the accommodation view collapses back into cultural relativism because you end up saying that God accommodated to a range of actions that you could accommodate to in the ancient Near East, even though you couldn't accommodate to them today. You couldn't accommodate to civilian slaughter today, but somehow you could in the ancient Near East. That again is just de facto cultural relativism. This, to conclude, is the maddening position of contemporary evangelical teaching and apologetics, specifically when it comes to biblical violence. Cultural relativism and cognitive dissonance remain widespread within the subculture of evangelicalism. And what most frustrates me about it all is that there is this air of moral superiority along with it, where they are somehow better than all of these secular, atheist, humanist, cultural relativists who don't have an objective ground for moral value. When the evangelical themselves denounces, de facto rejects moral objectivism in favor of this woolly cultural relativism. To conclude, I've included a link below to my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, which most of you would know is my long form critique of many of these same topics.